Ruth, Chapter 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ruth, by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 2. Ruth goes to the Shire Hall. In due time that evening, Mrs. Mason collected her young ladies for an inspection of their appearance before proceeding to the Shire Hall. Her eager, important, hurried manner of summoning them was not unlike that of a hen clucking her chickens together, and, to judge from the close investigation they had to undergo, it might have been thought that their part in the evening's performance was to be far more important than that of temporary ladies' maids. "Is that your best frock, Miss Hilton?" asked Mrs. Mason, in a half-dissatisfied tone, turning Ruth about, for it was only her Sunday black silk, and was somewhat worn and shabby. "Yes, ma'am," answered Ruth quietly. "Oh, indeed, then it will do." Still the half-satisfied tone. "Dress, young lady, you know, is a very secondary consideration. Conduct is everything. Still, Miss Hilton, I think you should write and ask your guardian to send you some money for another gown. I am sorry I did not think of it before." "I do not think he would send any if I wrote," answered Ruth, in a low voice. "He was angry when I wanted a shawl when the cold weather set in." Mrs. Mason gave her a little push of dismissal, and Ruth fell into the ranks by her friend, Miss Wood. "Never mind, Ruthie, you're prettier than any of them," said a merry, good-natured girl, whose plainness excluded her from any of the envy of rivalry. "Yes, I know I am pretty," said Ruth sadly, "but I am sorry I have no better gown, for this is very shabby. I am ashamed of it myself, and I can see Mrs. Mason is twice as much ashamed. I wish I need not go. I did not know we should have to think about our own dress at all, or I should not have wished to go." "Never mind, Ruth," said Jenny. "You have been looked at now, and Mrs. Mason will soon be too busy to think about you and your gown." "Did you hear Ruth Hilton say she knew she was pretty?" whispered one girl to another, so loudly that Ruth caught the words. "I could not help knowing," answered she simply, "for many people have told me so." At length these preliminaries were over, and they were walking briskly through the frosty air. The free motion was so inspiring that Ruth almost danced along, and quite forgot all about shabby gowns and grumbling guardians. The Shire Hall was even more striking than she had expected. The sides of the staircase were painted with figures that showed ghostly in the dim light, for only their faces looked out of the dark, dingy canvas, with a strange, fixed stare of expression. The young milliners had to arrange their wares on tables in the anteroom, and make all ready before they could venture to peep into the hall-room, where the musicians were already tuning their instruments, and where one or two charwomen, strange contrast with their dirty loose attire and their incessant chatter to the grand echoes of the vaulted room, were completing the dusting of benches and chairs. They quitted the place as Ruth and her companions entered. They had talked lightly and merrily in the anteroom, but now their voices were hushed, awed by the old magnificence of the vast apartment. It was so large that objects showed dim at the further end, as through a mist. Full-length figures of county worthies hung around, in all varieties of costume from the days of Holbein to the present time. The lofty roof was indistinct, for the lamps were not fully lighted yet, while through the richly painted Gothic window at one end the moonbeams fell, many tinted, on the floor, and mocked with their vividness the struggles of the artificial light to illuminate its little sphere. High above sounded the musicians, fitfully trying some strain of which they were not certain. Then they stopped playing and talked, and their voices sounded goblin-like in their dark recess, where candles were carried about in an uncertain wavering manner, reminding Ruth of the flickering zigzag motion of the will-o'-the-wisp. Suddenly the room sprang into the full blaze of light, and Ruth felt less impressed with its appearance, and more willing to obey Mrs. Mason's sharp summons to her wandering flock, than she had been when it was dim and mysterious. They had presently enough to do in rendering offices of assistance to the ladies who thronged in, and whose voices drowned all the muffled sound of the band Ruth had longed so much to hear. Still, if one pleasure was less, another was greater than she had anticipated. On condition of such a number of little observances that Ruth thought Mrs. Mason would never have ended enumerating them, they were allowed during the dances to stand at a side door and watch. And what a beautiful sight it was, floating away to that bounding music, now far away, like garlands of fairies, now near, and showing as lovely women, with every ornament of graceful dress, the elite of the county danced on, little caring whose eyes gazed and were dazzled. Outside all was cold and colourless and uniform, one coating of snow over all. But inside it was warm and glowing and vivid. Flowers scented the air, and wreathed the head and rested on the bosom as if it were midsummer. Bright colours flashed on the eye and were gone, and succeeded by others as lovely in the rapid movement of the dance. Smiles dimpled every face, and low tones of happiness murmured indistinctly through the room in every pause of the music. Ruth did not care to separate figures that formed a joyous and brilliant whole. It was enough to gaze, and the dream of the happy smoothness of the lives in which such music, and such profusion of flowers, of jewels, elegance of every description, and beauty of all shapes and hues, were everyday things. She did not want to know who the people were, although to hear a catalogue of names seemed to be the great delight of most of her companions. In fact, the enumeration rather disturbed her, and, to avoid the shock of too rapid a descent into the commonplace world of Miss Smiths and Mr. Thompsons, she returned to her post in the anteroom. There she stood, thinking or dreaming. She was startled back to actual life by a voice close to her. One of the dancing young ladies had met with a misfortune. Her dress, of some gossamer material, had been looped up by nosegays of flowers, and one of these had fallen off in the dance, leaving her gown to trail. To repair this, she had begged her partner to bring her to the room where the assistants should have been. None were there but Ruth. "Shall I leave you?" asked the gentleman. "Is my absence necessary?" "Oh, no," replied the lady. "A few stitches will set all to rights. Besides, I dare not enter that room by myself." So far she spoke sweetly and prettily, but now she addressed Ruth. "Make haste. Don't keep me an hour." And her voice became cold and authoritative. She was very pretty, with long dark ringlets and sparkling black eyes. These had struck Ruth in the hasty glance she had taken before she knelt down to her task. She also saw that the gentleman was young and elegant. "Oh, that lovely galop! How I long to dance to it! Will it never be done? What a frightful time you are taking, and I'm dying to return in time for this galop." By way of showing a pretty childlike impatience, she began to beat time with her feet to the spirited air the band was playing. Ruth could not darn the rent in her dress with this continual motion, and she looked up to remonstrate. As she threw her head back for this purpose, she caught the eye of the gentleman who was standing by. It was so expressive of amusement at the airs and graces of his pretty partner, that Ruth was infected by the feeling, and had to bend her face down to conceal the smile that mantled there. But not before he had seen it, and not before his attention had been thereby drawn to consider the kneeling figure, that, habited in black up to the throat, with the noble head bent down to the occupation in which she was engaged, formed such a contrast to the flippant, bright, artificial girl, who sat to be served with an air as haughty as a queen on her throne. "Oh, Mr Bellingham, I'm ashamed to detain you so long. I had no idea any one could have spent so much time over a little tear. No wonder Mrs Mason charges so much for dressmaking, if her workwomen are so slow." It was meant to be witty, but Mr Bellingham looked grave. He saw the scarlet colour of annoyance flush to that beautiful cheek, which was partially presented to him. He took a candle from the table, and held it so that Ruth had more light. She did not look up to thank him, for she felt ashamed that he should have seen the smile which she had caught from him. "I am sorry I have been so long, ma'am," she said gently, as she finished her work. "I was afraid it might tear out again if I did not do it carefully." She rose. "I would rather have it torn than have missed that charming galop," said the young lady, shaking out her dress as a bird shakes its plumage. "Shall we go, Mr Bellingham?" looking up at him. He was surprised that she gave no word or sign of thanks to the assistant. He took up a camellia that someone had left on the table. "Allow me, Miss Dunscombe, to give this, in your name, to this young lady, as thanks for her dexterous help." "Oh, of course," said she. Ruth received the flowers silently, but with a grave, modest motion of her head. They had gone, and she was once more alone. Presently her companions returned. "What was the matter with Miss Dunscombe? Did she come here?" asked they. "Only her lace dress was torn, and I mended it," answered Ruth quickly. "Did Mr Bellingham come with her? They say he's going to be married to her. Did he come, Ruth?" "Yes," said Ruth, and relapsed into silence. Mr Bellingham danced on gaily and merrily through the night, and fitted with Miss Dunscombe as he thought good. But he looked often to the side door, where the milliners' apprentices stood, and once he recognised the tall, slight figure, and the rich auburn hair of the girl in black, and then his eyes sought for the camellia. It was there, snowy white in her bosom, and he danced on more gaily than ever. The cold grey dawn was drearily lighting up the streets when Mrs Mason and her company returned home. The lamps were extinguished, yet the shutters of the shops and dwelling houses were not opened. All sounds had an echo unheard of by day. One or two houseless beggars sat on doorsteps, and, shivering, slept with heads bowed on their knees, or resting against the cold, hard support afforded by the wall. Ruth felt as if a dream had melted away, and she were once more in the actual world. How long would it be, even in the most favourable chance, before she should again enter the Shire Hall, or hear a band of music, or even see again those bright happy people, as much without any semblance of care or woe as if they belonged to another race of beings? Had they ever to deny themselves a wish, much less a want? Literally and figuratively, their lives seemed to wander through flowery pleasure paths. Here was cold biting midwinter for her, and such as her, for those poor beggars, almost a season of death. but to Miss Dunscombe and her companions a happy merry time, when flowers still bloomed, and fires crackled, and comforts and luxuries were piled around them like fairy gifts. What did they know of the meaning of the word so terrific to the poor? What was winter to them? But Ruth fancied that Mr. Bellingham looked as if he could understand the feelings of those removed from him by circumstance and station. He had drawn up the windows of his carriage, it is true, with a shudder. Ruth, then, had been watching him. Yet she had no idea that any association made her camellia precious to her. She believed it was solely on account of its exquisite beauty that she tended it so carefully. She told Jenny every particular of its presentation, with open, straight-looking eye, and without the deepening of a shade of colour. Was it not kind of him? You can't think how nicely he did it, just when I was a little bit mortified by her ungracious ways. It was very nice indeed, replied Jenny. Such a beautiful flower. I wish it had some scent. I wish it to be exactly as it is. It is perfect, so pure, said Ruth, almost clasping her treasure as she placed it in water. Who is Mr. Bellingham? He is son to that Mrs. Bellingham of the Priory, for whom we made the grey satin pelisse, answered Jenny sleepily. That was before my time, said Ruth. But there was no answer. Jenny was asleep. It was long before Ruth followed her example. Even on a winter day, it was clear morning light that fell upon her face as she smiled in her slumber. Jenny would not waken her, but watched her face with admiration. It was so lovely in its happiness. She is dreaming of last night, thought Jenny. It was true she was, but one figure flitted more than all the rest through her visions. He presented flower after flower to her in that baseless morning dream, which was all too quickly ended. The night before she had seen her dead mother in her sleep, and she wakened weeping, and now she dreamed of Mr. Bellingham and smiled. And yet, was this a more evil dream than the other? The realities of life seemed to cut more sharply against her heart than usual that morning. The late hours of the preceding nights, and perhaps the excitement of the evening before, had indisposed her to bear calmly the rubs and crosses which beset all Mrs. Mason's young ladies at times. For Mrs. Mason, though the first dressmaker in the county, was human after all, and suffered like her apprentices from the same causes that affected them. This morning she was disposed to find fault with everything and everybody. She seemed to have risen with a determination of putting the world, and all that it contained, her world at least, to rights before night, and abuses and negligence, which had long passed unreproved or winked at, were to-day to be dragged to light and sharply reprimanded. Nothing less than perfection would satisfy Mrs. Mason at such times. She had her ideas of justice too, but they were not divinely beautiful and true ideas. They were something more resembling a grocer's or tea-dealer's ideas of equal right. A little overindulgence last night was to be balanced by a good deal of over-severity to-day, and this manner of rectifying previous errors fully satisfied her conscience. Ruth was not inclined for, or capable of, much extra exertion, and it would have tasked all her powers to have pleased her superior. The workroom seemed filled with sharp calls. "Miss Hilton, where have you put the blue Persian?" Whenever things are mislaid, I know it has been Miss Hilton's evening for siding away. "Miss Hilton was going out last night, so I offered to clear the workroom for her." "I will find it directly, ma'am," answered one of the girls. "Oh, I am well aware of Miss Hilton's custom of shuffling off her duties upon any one who can be induced to relieve her," replied Mrs. Mason. Ruth reddened, and tears sprang to her eyes, but she was so conscious of the falsity of the accusation that she rebuked herself for being moved by it, and raising her head, gave a proud look round, as if in appeal to her companions. "Where's the skirt of Lady Farnham's dress? The flounce is not put on? I am surprised. May I ask to whom this work was entrusted yesterday?" inquired Mrs. Mason, fixing her eyes on Ruth. "I was to have done it, but I made a mistake, and had to undo it. I am very sorry." "I might have guessed, certainly. There is little difficulty, to be sure, in discovering when work has been neglected or spoilt, into whose hands it has fallen." Such were the speeches which fell to Ruth's share on this day of all days, when she was least fitted to bear them with equanimity. In the afternoon it was necessary for Mrs. Mason to go a few miles into the country. She left injunctions, and orders, and directions, and prohibitions without end, but at last she was gone, and in the relief of her absence, Ruth laid her arms on the table, and burying her head, began to cry aloud, with weak, unchecked sobs. "Don't cry, Miss Hilton. Ruthie, never mind the old dragon. How will you bear on for 5 years, if you don't spirit yourself up not to care a straw for what she says?" were some of the modes of comfort and sympathy administered by the young workwomen. Jenny, with a wiser insight into the grievance and its remedy, said, "Suppose Ruth goes out instead of you, Fanny Barton, to do the errands. The fresh air will do her good. And you know you dislike the cold east winds, while Ruth says she enjoys frost and snow, and all kinds of shivery weather." Fanny Barton was a great sleepy-looking girl, huddling over the fire. No one so willing as she to relinquish the walk on this bleak afternoon, when the east wind blew keenly down the street, drying up the very snow itself. There was no temptation to come abroad, for those who were not absolutely obliged to leave their warm rooms. Indeed, the dusked hour showed that it was the usual tea time for the humble inhabitants of that part of the town through which Ruth had to pass on her shopping expedition. As she came to the high ground just above the river, where the street sloped rapidly down to the bridge, she saw the flat country beyond all, covered with snow, making the black dome of the cloud-laden sky appear yet blacker, as if the winter's night had never fairly gone away, but had hovered on the edge of the world all through the short bleak day. Down by the bridge, where there was a little shelving bank, used as a landing place for any pleasure boats that could float on that shallow stream, some children were playing, and, defying the cold, one of them had got a large washing tub, and with the use of a broken oar kept steering and pushing himself hither and thither in the little creek, much to the admiration of his companions, who stood gravely looking on, immovable in their attentive observation of the hero, although their faces were blue with cold, and their hands crammed deep into their pockets with some faint hope of finding warmth there. Perhaps they feared that, if they unpacked themselves from their lumpy attitudes and began to move about, the cruel wind would find its way into every cranny of their tattered dress. They were all huddled up, and still, with eyes intent on the embryo sailor. At last, one little man, envious of the reputation that his playfellow was acquiring by his daring, called out, "I'll set thee a craddy, Tom. Thou daren't go over yon black line in the water out into the real river." Of course, the challenge was not to be refused, and Tom paddled away towards the dark line, beyond which the river swept with smooth, steady current. Ruth, a child in years herself, stood at the top of the declivity, watching the adventurer, but as unconscious of any danger as the group of children below. At their playfellow's success, they broke through the calm gravity of observation into boisterous marks of applause, clapping their hands and stamping their impatient little feet, and shouting, "Well done, Tom! Thou hast done it rarely!" Tom stood in childish dignity for a moment, facing his admirers. Then, in an instant, his washing-tub boat was whirled around, and he lost his balance and fell out, and both he and his boat were carried away slowly but surely by the strong full river which eternally moved onwards to the sea. The children shrieked aloud with terror, and Ruth flew down to the little bay, and far into its shallow waters, before she felt how useless such an action was, and that the sensible plan would have been to seek for efficient help. Hardly had this thought struck her, when louder and sharper than the sullen roar of the stream that was ceaselessly and unrelentingly flowing on, came the splash of a horse galloping through the water in which she was standing. Past her like lightning, down in the stream, swimming along with the current, a stooping rider, an outstretched grasping arm, a little life redeemed, and a child saved to those who loved it. Ruth stood dizzy and sick with emotion while all this took place, and when the rider turned the swimming horse and slowly breasted up the river to the landing place, she recognised him as the Mr. Bellingham of the night before. He carried the unconscious child across his horse. The body hung in so lifeless a manner that Ruth believed it was dead, and her eyes were suddenly blinded with tears. She waded back to the beach, to the point toward which Mr. Bellingham was directing his horse. "Is he dead?" asked she, stretching out her arms to receive the little fellow, for she instinctively felt that the position in which he hung was not the most conducive to returning consciousness, if indeed it would ever return. "I think not," answered Mr. Bellingham, as he gave the child to her, before springing off his horse. "Is he your brother? Do you know who he is?" "Look!" said Ruth, who had sat down upon the ground, the better to prop the poor lad. "His hand twitches. He lives. Oh, sir, he lives. Whose boy is he?" to the people who came hurrying and gathering to the spot at the rumour of an accident. "He's old Nelly Brownson," said they, "her grandson." "We must take him into a house directly," said she. "Is his home far off?" No, it's just close by." "One of you go for a doctor at once," said Mr. Bellingham authoritatively, "and bring him to the old woman's without delay. You must not hold him any longer," he continued, speaking to Ruth, and remembering her face now for the first time. "Your dress is dripping wet already. Here, you fellow, take him up, d'ye see?" But the child's hand had nervously clenched Ruth's dress, and she would not have him disturbed. She carried her heavy burden very tenderly toward a mean little cottage indicated by the neighbours. An old crippled woman was coming out of the door, shaking all over with agitation. "Dear heart," said she, "he's the last of 'em all, and he's gone afore me." "Nonsense!" said Mr. Bellingham. "The boy is alive, and likely to live." But the old woman was helpless and hopeless, and insisted on believing that her grandson was dead; and dead he would have been if it had not been for Ruth, and one or two of the more sensible neighbours, who, under Mr. Bellingham's directions, bustled about, and did all that was necessary until animation was restored. "What a confounded time those people are in fetching the doctor!" said Mr. Bellingham to Ruth, between whom and himself a sort of silent understanding had sprung up from the circumstances of their having been the only two, besides mere children, who had witnessed the accident, and also the only two to whom a certain degree of cultivation had given the power of understanding each other's thoughts and even each other's words. "It takes so much to knock an idea into such stupid people's heads. They stood gaping and asking which doctor they were to go for, as if it signified whether it was Brown or Smith, so long as he had his wits about him. I have no more time to waste here either. I was on the gallop when I caught sight of the lad, and now he has fairly sobbed and opened his eyes. I see no use in my staying in this stifling atmosphere. May I trouble you with one thing? Will you be so good as to see that the little fellow has all that he wants? If you'll allow me, I'll leave you my purse," continued he, giving it to Ruth, who was only too glad to have this power entrusted to her of procuring one or two requisites which she had perceived to be wanted. But she saw some gold between the network. She did not like the charge of such riches. "I shall not want so much, really, sir. 1 sovereign will be plenty, more than enough. May I take that out, and I will give you back what is left of it when I see you again? Or perhaps I had better send it to you, sir." "I think you had better keep it all at present. Oh, what a horrid, dirty place! This is insufferable. 2 minutes longer. You must not stay here. You'll be poisoned with this abominable air. Come toward the door, I beg. Well, if you think 1 sovereign will be enough, I will take my purse. Only remember, you apply to me if you think they want more." They were standing at the door, where someone was holding Mr. Bellingham's horse. Ruth was looking at him with her earnest eyes. Mrs. Mason and her errands quite forgotten in the interest of the afternoon's event, her whole thoughts bent upon rightly understanding and following out his wishes for the little boy's welfare, and until now this had been the first object in his own mind. But at this moment the strong perception of Ruth's exceeding beauty came again upon him. He almost lost the sense of what he was saying, he was so startled with admiration. The night before he had not seen her eyes, and now they looked straight and innocently full at him, grave, earnest, and deep. But when she instinctively read the change in the expression of his countenance, she dropped her large white veiling lids, and he thought her face was lovelier still. The irresistible impulse seized him to arrange matters, so that he might see her again before long. "No," said he, "I see it would be better that you should keep the purse. Many things may be wanted for the lad which we cannot calculate upon now. If I remember rightly, there are 3 sovereigns and some loose change. I shall, perhaps, see you again in a few days, when, if there be any money left in the purse, you can restore it to me." "Oh, yes, sir," said Ruth, alive to the magnitude of the wants to which she might have to administer, and yet rather afraid of the responsibility implied in the possession of so much money. "Is there any chance of my meeting you again in this house?" asked he. "I hope to come whenever I can, sir, but I must run in errand times, and I don't know when my turn may be." Oh, he did not fully understand this answer. "I should like to know how you think the boy is going on. If it is not giving you too much trouble, do you ever take walks?" "Not for walking's sake, sir." "Well," he said, "you go to church, I suppose. Mrs. Mason does not keep you at work on Sundays, I trust?" "Oh, no, sir. I go to church regularly." "Then perhaps you will be so good as to tell me what church you go to, and I will meet you there next Sunday afternoon." "I go to St. Nicholas's, sir. I will take care and bring you word how the boy is, and what the doctor they get, and I will keep an account of the money I spend." "Very well, thank you. Remember, I trust to you." He meant that he relied on her promise to meet him, but Ruth thought that he was referring to the responsibility of doing the best she could for the child. He was going away, when a fresh thought struck him, and he turned back into the cottage once more, and addressed Ruth with half a smile on his countenance. "It seems rather strange, but we have no one to introduce us. My name is Bellingham. Yours is—" "Ruth Hilton, sir," she answered in a low voice, for now that the conversation no longer related to the boy, she felt shy and restrained. He held out his hand to shake hers, and just as she gave it to him, the old grandmother came tottering up to ask some question. The interrogation jarred upon him, and made him once more keenly alive to the closeness of the air, and the squalor and dirt by which he was surrounded. "My good woman," said he to Nelly Brownson, "could you not keep your place a little neater and cleaner? It is more fit for pigs than human beings. The air in this room is quite offensive, and the dirt and filth is really disgraceful."
By this time he was mounted, and bowing to Ruth, he rode away. Then the old woman's wrath broke out. "Who may you be that knows no better manners than to come into a poor woman's house to abuse it? Fit for pigs, indeed! What do you call yon fellow?" "He is Mr. Bellingham," said Ruth, shocked at the old woman's apparent ingratitude. "It was he that rode into the water to save your grandson. He would have been drowned but for Mr. Bellingham. I thought once they would both have been swept away by the current, it was so strong." "The river is none so deep either," the old woman said, anxious to diminish as much as possible the obligation she was under to one who had offended her. "Some one else would have saved him if this fine young spark had never been here. He's an orphan, and God watches over orphans, they say. I'd rather it had been any one else as had picked him out, than one who comes into a poor body's house only to abuse it." "He did not come in only to abuse it," said Ruth gently. "He came with little Tom. He only said it was not quite so clean as it might be." "What! You're taking up the cry, are you? Wait till you are an old woman like me, crippled with rheumatiz, and a lad to see after like Tom, who is always in mud and isn't when he isn't in water, and his food and mine to scrape together. God knows we're often short, and I do the best I can, and water to fetch up that steep brow." She stopped to cough, and Ruth judiciously changed the subject, and began to consult the old woman as to the wants of her grandson, in which consultation they were soon assisted by the medical man. When Ruth had made one or two arrangements with a neighbour whom she asked to procure the most necessary things, and had heard from the doctor that all would be right in a day or two, she began to quake at the recollection of the length of time she had spent at Nelly Brownson's, and to remember, with some affright, the strict watch kept by Mrs. Mason over her apprentice's outgoings and incomings on working days. She hurried off to the shops and tried to recall her wandering thoughts to the respective merits of pink and blue as a match to lilac, found she had lost her patterns, and went home with ill-chosen things, and in a fit of despair at her own stupidity. The truth was that the afternoon's adventure filled her mind. Only the figure of Tom, who was now safe and likely to do well, was receding into the background, and that of Mr. Bellingham becoming more prominent than it had been. His spirited and natural action of galloping into the water to save the child was magnified by Ruth into the most heroic deed of daring. His interest about the boy was tender, thoughtful benevolence in her eyes, and his careless liberality of money was fine generosity, for she forgot that generosity implies some degree of self-denial. She was gratified, too, by the power of dispensing comfort he had entrusted to her, and was busy with Alnaschar visions of wise expenditure, when the necessity of opening Mrs. Mason's house door summoned her back into actual present life, and the dread of an immediate scolding. For this time, however, she was spared, but spared for such a reason that she would have been thankful for some blame in preference to her impunity. During her absence, Jenny's difficulty of breathing had suddenly become worse, and the girls had, on their own responsibility, put her to bed, and were standing round her in dismay, when Mrs. Mason's return home, only a few minutes before Ruth arrived, fluttered them back into the workroom. And now all was confusion and hurry, a doctor to be sent for, a mind to be unburdened of directions for a dress to a forewoman who was too ill to understand, scoldings to be scattered with no illiberal hand amongst a group of frightened girls, hardly sparing the poor invalid herself for her inopportune illness. In the middle of all this turmoil, Ruth crept quietly to her place, with a heavy, saddened heart, at the indisposition of the gentle forewoman. She would gladly have nursed Jenny herself, and often longed to do it, but she could not be spared. Hands unskilful in fine and delicate work would be well enough qualified to tend the sick until the mother arrived from home. Meanwhile, extra diligence was required in the workroom, and Ruth found no opportunity of going to see little Tom, or to fulfil the plans for making him and his grandmother more comfortable, which she had proposed to herself. She regretted her rash promise to Mr. Bellingham of attending to the little boy's welfare. All that she could do was done by means of Mrs. Mason's servant, through whom she made inquiries and sent the necessary help. The subject of Jenny's illness was the prominent one in the house. Ruth told of her own adventure, to be sure, but when she was at the very crisis of the boy's fall into the river, the more fresh and vivid interest of some tidings of Jenny was brought into the room, and Ruth ceased, almost blaming herself for caring for anything besides the question of life or death to be decided in that very house. Then a pale, gentle-looking woman was seen moving softly about, and it was whispered that this was the mother come to nurse her child. Everybody liked her. She was so sweet-looking, and gave so little trouble, and seemed so patient and so thankful for any inquiries about her daughter, whose illness, it was understood, although its severity was mitigated, was likely to be long and tedious. While all the feelings and thoughts relating to Jenny were predominant, Sunday arrived. Mrs. Mason went to the accustomed visit to her father's, making some little show of apology to Mrs. Wood for leaving her and her daughter. The apprentices dispersed to the various friends with whom they were in the habit of spending the day, and Ruth went to St. Nicholas with a sorrowful heart, depressed on account of Jenny, and self-reproachful at having rashly undertaken what she had been unable to perform. As she came out of the church she was joined by Mr. Bellingham. She had half hoped that he might have forgotten the arrangement, and yet she wished to relieve herself of her responsibility. She knew his step behind her, and the contending feelings made her heart beat hard, and she longed to run away. "Miss Hilton, I believe," said he, overtaking her, and bowing forward, so as to catch a sight of her rose-red face. "How is our little sailor going on? Well, I trust, from the symptoms the other day?" "I believe, sir, he is quite well now. I am very sorry, but I have not been able to go and see him. I am so sorry. I could not help it. But I have got one or two things through another person. I have put them down on this slip of paper, and here's your purse, sir, for I am afraid I can do nothing more for him. We have illness in the house, and it makes us very busy." Ruth had been so much accustomed to blame of late that she almost anticipated some remonstrance or reproach now for not having fulfilled her promise better. She little guessed that Mr. Bellingham was far more busy trying to devise some excuse for meeting her again, during the silence that succeeded her speech, than displeased with her for not bringing a more particular account of the little boy, in whom he had ceased to feel any interest. She repeated, after a minute's pause, "I am very sorry I have done so little, sir." "Oh, yes, I am sure you have done all you could. It was thoughtless in me to add to your engagements." "He is displeased with me," thought Ruth, "for what he believes to have been neglect of the boy, whose life he risked his own to save. If I told all, he would see that I could not do more, but I cannot tell him all the sorrows and worries that have taken up my time. And yet I am tempted to give you another little commission, if it is not taking up too much of your time, and presuming too much on your good nature," said he, a bright idea having just struck him. "Mrs. Mason lives in Heneage Place, does she not? My mother's ancestors lived there, and once, when the house was being repaired, she took me in to show me the old place. There was an old hunting piece painted on a panel over one of the chimney pieces. The figures were portraits of my ancestors. I have often thought I should like to purchase it, if it still remained there. Can you ascertain this for me, and bring me word next Sunday?" "Oh, yes, sir," said Ruth, glad that this commission was completely within her power to execute, and anxious to make up for her previous seeming neglect.
I'll look directly I get home, and ask Mrs Mason to write and let you know." "Thank you," said he, only half satisfied. "I think perhaps, however, it might be as well not to trouble Mrs Mason about it. You see, it would compromise me, and I am not quite determined to purchase the picture. If you would ascertain whether the painting is there, and tell me, I would take a little time to reflect, and afterwards I could apply to Mrs Mason myself." "Very well, sir, I will see about it." So they parted. Before the next Sunday, Mrs Wood had taken her daughter to her distant home, to recruit in that quiet place. Ruth watched her down the street from an upper window, and, sighing deep and long, returned to the workroom whence the warning voice and gentle wisdom had departed. Chapter 3